My name is Everett Cole. I am 66 years old, and I would learn, though not for a while yet, that the nephew I'd raised like my own son had decided my life was worth less to him than a debt he was too ashamed to speak out loud. I didn't know that yet. That evening, standing on my own porch watching a truck I didn't recognize kick up dust down the county road, all I felt was something I hadn't felt in 8 months. Hope. The Coleridge Cattle Ranch has belonged to my family for 3 generations, 4,200 acres of caliche soil and mesquite scrub outside Marfa, Texas, that my father bought with a war bonus and the stubbornness of a man who'd seen too much to be scared of drought. He handed it to me the year I turned 28, standing in this same yard, and told me the only thing he ever told me about running it. "This land doesn't lie to you, Everett," he said. "People might. The land never will." My wife June used to say the same thing, word for word, right up until the cancer took the last of her breath 3 years ago. She'd stand on this porch some evenings with a glass of tea sweating in her hand and watch the cattle move across the north pasture like slow gray clouds, and she'd tell me that a man could trust dirt and grass a lot further than he could trust most of the people standing on it. I believed her. I still do. I just didn't believe it applied to my own family. June and I never had children of our own. When my sister Diane's marriage came apart in an ugly custody fight 20 years back, her boy Colton came to live with us. He was 12, angry in the particular quiet way boys get when nobody's asked them what they actually want, and June loved him like he'd come out of her own body. I taught him to ride before he could properly read a map. I taught him to mend fence, to doctor a sick calf at 2 in the morning, to shoot straight and tell the truth, in roughly that order of urgency. For 6 years, Colton was the best thing that ever happened to this ranch besides June herself. Then he turned 18, and Dallas called to him louder than any of it ever had. I didn't blame him for leaving. Ranch life is hard, unglamorous work, and a boy who'd spent his childhood watching his own father chase easy money in and out of failed schemes was bound to want something that looked like it moved faster. Colton wanted lights and noise, and the particular kind of promise that cities make to young men who've never been burned by them yet. He called every week, that first year, then every month. Then, somewhere in the last 2 years, the calls thinned out to birthdays and a Christmas voicemail he never quite managed to return in person. June's funeral was the last time I'd seen him stand on this porch, and even then he'd left before the reception ended, mumbling something about a flight he needed to catch. 8 months of silence followed that. 8 months where I ran 4,200 acres with 3 hired hands and a body that reminded me, more each year, that 66 wasn't the same as 46. So when his truck came rattling up the county road that Thursday evening, unannounced, I felt something in my chest lift that I hadn't expected to feel again. He climbed out grinning, thinner than I remembered, wearing boots that had clearly never touched anything rougher than a parking garage. He hugged me the way he used to as a boy, quick and a little too hard, like he was trying to prove something with the force of it. "Uncle Ev." His voice cracked, just slightly, and I told myself it was emotion and not something else. I know I've been gone too long. I know I don't deserve to just show up like this. I've just been thinking about Aunt June, about everything you two did for me, and I wanted to come back, get back to my roots, actually be useful for once instead of just taking up space on holidays. We sat on the porch that night the way we used to, a fire of mesquite wood crackling in the pit June had built with her own hands, the smoke curling up thick and sweet into the dark. Colton talked about wanting to learn the ranch again, really learn it this time, not like a kid being handed chores, but like a man ready to earn something. I wanted to believe every word of it. God help me. I did believe it, for a few hours anyway. It was near the end of the evening, when the fire had burned down to coals and the crickets had taken over the quiet, that he brought up the fence. "The north line's been giving you trouble, right? Past the windmill." He said it casually, like he'd just remembered it, though I hadn't mentioned the fence to him at all that night. "Let me handle the check tomorrow." "Actually, no. Let you do it. I'll walk the line with you myself. Show you I still remember what a bad splice looks like. Just the two of us. Early, before the hands even wake up, before it gets hot." I should have asked how he knew about the north fence at all. I should have wondered why a boy who hadn't set foot on this property in 8 months already had an opinion about which stretch of wire needed walking, and why it needed to be walked alone, before sunrise, before anyone else was awake to see it. Instead, I heard my nephew asking to spend a quiet morning with me the way he used to when he was 12, and something in my chest that had been closed since June died creaked open like the old screen door on the kitchen, the one she'd meant to fix for 15 years and never got around to. "I'd like that," I told him, and meant it completely. I sat on that porch a while longer after he'd gone inside to sleep in his old room, turning my father's pocket knife over in my hand the way I always do when I'm working something out of my mind. The bone handle worn smooth on one side from 40 years of the same absent-minded turning. I told myself I was being an old fool, suspicious of my own blood, for no reason at all except grief and loneliness, making shadows out of nothing. I did not know, sitting there with that knife warm in my palm, that somewhere down in Marfa that same evening, my nephew had already made a phone call to a man whose name I would come to know very well in the days ahead. I did not know that the north fence line, the one he wanted me to walk alone before the hands woke, had already been chosen for reasons that had nothing to do with a bad splice in the wire. All I knew was that my nephew was home, and the fire was warm, and for the first time in 8 months, the ranch didn't feel quite so empty. I knew was that my nephew was home, and the fire was warm, and for the first time in 8 months, the ranch didn't feel quite so empty. The next morning, that feeling started to curdle. Colton was up before me, which was strange enough on its own. The boy I remembered had to be dragged out of bed with coffee and a raised voice. He was already dressed, already out by the north pasture fence with his hands in his pockets, staring down the line toward the old windmill like he was reading something written in the dirt. "Morning," I said, coming up beside him. "You're up early for a city boy." Couldn't sleep. He didn't look at me when he said it. Kept thinking about the fence. We walked part of the line together that morning, and it was there I first noticed the boots. Good leather, barely broken in. The kind of boots a man buys online because he thinks they look the part rather than because he's ever needed them to survive a day of real work. They were caked in dust within 20 minutes, and Colton kept glancing down at them like he resented the ranch for ruining something. At breakfast, his phone buzzed against the table, face down. He flipped it immediately, read something in half a second, and put it face down again before I could ask who it was. "Work stuff," he said, before I'd said a word. I hadn't asked. Over the course of that day, it happened 3 more times, the phone buzzing, Colton's shoulders tightening a fraction before he even looked at the screen, a number I didn't recognize and he never named. Once, at the sink washing up after lunch, I caught a glimpse of it lit up on the counter. No name attached, just 10 digits and a local area code I didn't place. Everything all right? I asked him that evening, over the fire again, the same fire. The same mesquite smoke curling into a sky gone the color of a bad bruise. "Course," he said, too fast, too easy. "Just excited to help out tomorrow. You still good for the north fence?" "Early, like we talked about." "Past the windmill," I said. "Wire's down bad there. You should go first thing, before it gets hot. I'll make sure nobody touches it till you see it yourself." He said it exactly like that, word for word. The same sentence he'd used the night before, like he'd rehearsed it and was afraid of straying from a script. I told him I would. I meant it when I said it. Some part of me, the part that had spent 40 years reading weather and cattle and the particular silence a man makes right before he lies. Some part of me was already uneasy, but I did what grieving, lonely old men do. I told that part of myself to hush. I went to bed around 10. I did not know, lying there in the dark with June's side of the bed still cool and empty after 3 years, that Colton had driven into Marfa that evening while I thought he was walking the south pasture, and that he'd made a phone call from the parking lot of a bar called the Lost Horse to a man he owed more money than I would learn to fully understand for weeks yet. I did not know that the man on the other end of that call had already agreed on a price and a place and a time. I was asleep or close enough to it when I heard the dogs start up outside. Not their usual bark at a coyote or a passing truck, but something sharper, more insistent, the kind of barking that means a person is coming and the dogs haven't decided yet whether that's good news. Then I heard hooves. Hard, fast. A horse pushed well past any sensible pace for the dark hour it was. By the time I got my boots on and made it to the porch, Rosa Delgado was already off her horse and pounding on my door with a fist that told me this wasn't a social call. She'd worked this ranch for 11 years, since she was 24, and in all that time I had never once seen her ride in from the line camp after dark, let alone at a gallop that had left her horse lathered white with sweat and blowing hard through its nose. "Mr. Cole." Her voice came out rough, stripped down by 2 hours of cold night air and harder riding than any of us were built for anymore. "I'm sorry. I know it's late. I wouldn't have come like this if it could wait." "Rosa, what happened?" She looked past me, toward the house, toward the dark window of the room where Colton was sleeping, and something in her face made my stomach go tight before she'd said another word. "Don't go near that fence tomorrow," she said. "The north line, past the windmill. Please, Mr. Cole, don't go anywhere near it." "Don't go near that fence tomorrow," she said. "The north line, past the windmill. Please, Mr. Cole, don't go anywhere near it." I brought her inside, sat her down at the kitchen table where June used to keep the books, and put coffee on with hands that weren't quite steady. Rosa Delgado is not a woman given to riding 2 hours through the dark over nothing. In 11 years working this ranch, I had never once seen fear sit on her the way it sat there that night. "Tell me," I said. "I was in town this evening," she said, wrapping both hands around the mug I set in front of her like the heat of it might steady something inside her too. "Picking up feed at the co-op. I saw your nephew's truck outside the Lost Horse, so I parked around back to say hello. Maybe give him grief about coming home after so long." She stopped there, and I watched her decide, in real time, how much of the next part she wanted to say out loud. "He was on the phone in the parking lot," she went on. "I wasn't trying to listen, Mr. Cole. I swear that to you. But he was talking loud enough that I couldn't help it, and what he was saying stopped me before I could walk up and say anything." "What did you hear?" he said. "It has to look like an accident. Nobody can know it was arranged." Rosa's hands tightened around the mug. Then he said something about the fence. "The north line. Before sunrise," he said. "Before anyone else is awake to see it." The kitchen went very quiet. Somewhere out past the porch, one of the dogs barked once at nothing and settled. "He mentioned you by name," Rosa said, and her voice cracked slightly on the word, the first crack I'd heard in it all night. "He said, 'My uncle trusts me. He'll go exactly where I tell him to go.'" I sat with that for a long moment. 42 years of reading weather and cattle and men had not prepared me for the particular stillness of hearing my sister's boy say those words about me to a stranger in a bar parking lot. "Rosa," I said finally, "why are you telling me this instead of walking away and letting it be someone else's trouble?" She looked down at the coffee for a while before she answered. "My father worked a ranch outside Alpine for 30 years, she said. "Similar to this one. A fencing accident put him in a wheelchair when I was 16. Nobody ever investigated it properly, because the man who owned that spread had friends with badges, and my father was just hired help, and hired help doesn't get believed over an owner's word." She finally looked up at me. "I decided a long time ago that if I ever saw something like that happening again, and I stayed quiet, I'd be no better than the men who looked away from what happened to my father." I did not know, sitting there, the full shape of what Colton owed or to whom. I did not know yet about the man he'd called, or the price that had been agreed on, or how long this had been building underneath 8 months of silence I'd mistaken for simple busyness. All I knew was that my nephew had asked me, twice now, in nearly identical words, to walk that exact stretch of fence alone, before sunrise, before anyone else could see what happened there. I thought of my father's pocket knife in my jacket pocket, and closed my hand around it, without quite meaning to. "I need your help," I told Rosa. "But I need you safe more than I need your help. Whatever happens tomorrow, you stay well back. I won't have you caught up in whatever my family's become." She shook her head immediately, some of the fear in her face hardening into something closer to resolve. "I rode 2 hours in the dark, Mr. Cole. I'm not turning around now." We didn't sleep much after that. By 4 in the morning, I'd made a call to Deputy Hollis Reyes, who'd gone to school with my late brother-in-law and had known this ranch since before Colton was born. Hollis didn't ask many questions on the phone. He simply said he'd be there before first light, quiet, unmarked, and that I should walk that fence line exactly the way Colton expected me to. Like nothing's wrong, Hollis said. Let whoever's out there think it's working. I dressed in the dark an hour before dawn, the same clothes I'd wear on any ordinary morning, and I stood for a moment on the porch listening to the ranch wake up around me the way it always did. A rooster somewhere past the barn, the cattle beginning to shift, and low in the near pasture, the particular gray light that comes before the sun actually decides to rise. Colton was already up when I came inside for coffee, dressed and ready, entirely too alert for a man who claimed he hadn't slept well in days. "Ready?" he asked, and there was something in his voice I hadn't let myself hear the night before. Not affection, not nerves, something closer to relief. The specific relief of a man watching a plan finally reach the morning it was built for. "Ready," I told him, and picked up my hat, and walked out toward a fence line where a stranger was already waiting in the dark to make sure I never walked back. I picked up my hat, and walked out toward a fence line where a stranger was already waiting in the dark to make sure I never walked back. The walk to the north pasture takes 11 minutes on a normal morning. That morning it felt like an hour. I kept my pace steady, the same easy gait I've used to walk this ranch for 40 years, my hat low against the gray pre-dawn light, my father's pocket knife riding heavy in my jacket pocket. I did not look for Hollis Reyes or his deputy, though I knew they were out there somewhere in the mesquite, because looking for them would have meant looking like a man who expected trouble, and I needed, more than anything that morning, to look like exactly what Colton believed I was, an old fool walking alone into a trap he hadn't seen coming. The windmill came into view first, its blades turning slow and creaking against the sky, just beginning to bruise orange at the edges. Past it, the fence line ran straight for a quarter mile before it bent toward the arroyo, and it was somewhere along that bend, Rosa had told me, that the trouble was supposed to be waiting. I found it before I found him. A section of anchor post, rusted at the base like all the others, except this one had been worked loose deliberately. The bolt backed off just enough that a man leaning his weight against the wire while checking a splice would send the whole section collapsing, barbed wire snapping taut and whipping back with enough force to open a man's throat if it caught him wrong, or simply to knock him hard enough onto the rocks below the arroyo bank that nobody would ever ask too many questions about. A 70-year-old man found dead beside a fence he'd walked 10,000 times before. It would have looked, to anyone who found me, exactly like an accident. I closed my hand around the pocket knife in my pocket and made myself keep walking. I saw him then, a man I didn't recognize, crouched near the arroyo bank in a canvas jacket too heavy for the morning, watching the fence line the way a man watches something he's waiting to happen rather than something he's simply passing by. I stopped a good 20 yards off, exactly the way Hollis had told me to, and called out toward the loose section of wire. "This the stretch that's been giving trouble." The man straightened. For half a second, something in his face said he hadn't expected me to speak first, hadn't expected anything except an old man walking obliviously into a length of rigged wire. That half second was long enough. Hollis and his deputy came up out of the arroyo scrub on either side of him before he'd finished turning around, and the sound that followed wasn't gunfire or shouting, just the flat, practical click of a man's wrists being brought together behind his back while he was still working out what had gone wrong. "Don't move," Hollis said, and the man didn't, though his face had gone the particular gray color of someone watching a very expensive plan collapse in real time. I stood there at 20 yards, my heart going harder than it had any right to at my age, and watched a stranger get walked out of the mesquite in handcuffs on account of a fence line my nephew had described to me twice in identical words. I didn't even want to do it, the man said, to no one in particular, to Hollis, to the sky, maybe to himself. The money was too good to say no to. I've got kids. I needed the money. I did not know yet, standing there in the gray light with my hand still closed around my father's knife, exactly how much money he'd been promised, or by whom, or how long the arrangement had been building underneath 8 months of silence I'd mistaken for simple busyness. All I knew was that the man in handcuffs had a name, Dale Kessler, it turned out, a laid-off oil field hand from Odessa, with 3 kids and a truck payment he couldn't make, and that somewhere back at the house, my nephew was almost certainly checking his phone, waiting for a call that was never going to come the way he expected it to. Hollis walked him toward the county truck parked out of sight behind the windmill, and I stood there a moment longer, looking down at the loosened bolt, the collapsed section of wire that would have been the last thing I ever touched. Rosa came down from her position in the brush then, and neither of us said much of anything. She just stood beside me, looking at the same rigged wire, and I think we were both doing the same silent math about how close 2 years of my nephew's silence had come to becoming permanent. Dale Kessler talked before we'd even made it back to the house. Faced with charges that included conspiracy to commit murder, he did what men in his position generally do. He gave investigators everything he had, in exchange for whatever leniency a prosecutor might be willing to offer a man who'd been hired rather than the man who'd done the hiring. He named Colton within the first hour, before his own attorney had even arrived to advise him otherwise. Sheriff's investigators pulled Colton's phone records that same afternoon, and what they found didn't take long to understand. 14 calls in the last 3 weeks alone to a number registered to a man named Ray Solano, known to the Presidio County Sheriff's Department as a local bookmaker, who ran a sports betting operation out of the back room of a tire shop in Alpine. Bank records showed a pattern of losses stretching back nearly 2 years, thousands at a time, bleeding out faster than Colton's Dallas salary could ever have covered. I would learn, though not until later that week, that Colton owed Ray Solano just over $90,000, and that Solano didn't extend patience the way a bank might. I would learn about a conversation between the two of them, recorded on Solano's own phone as collateral against exactly this kind of denial, in which my nephew suggested that his uncle's ranch carried enough insurance and enough land value that an accident out on the property might solve both their problems at once. They arrested him at the Marigold Diner on Highland Avenue in Marfa, the same cracked vinyl booth where I used to buy him pancakes every Sunday morning when he was 12 years old, still angry and quiet, and grieving a family that had come apart around him before he'd even had the chance to understand why. He didn't run. He didn't argue. When the deputy read him his rights, Colton just sat there in that booth, staring at a coffee cup he hadn't touched, and said the only true thing he'd said to me in 8 months. "I thought I could pay it off before anyone found out," he said. "I thought it would just look like an accident, and it would all be over." I stood outside the diner window and watched them lead him out in handcuffs, past the same booth, the same cracked vinyl, the same faded photograph of the Chinati Mountains that had hung on that wall since before either of us was born, and I understood, standing there, that whatever came next was going to determine not just what happened to my nephew, but what was left of the family June and I had spent our whole lives trying to build around him. I understood, standing there, that whatever came next was going to determine not just what happened to my nephew, but what was left of the family June and I had spent our whole lives trying to build around him. It took investigators 3 more weeks to trace the full shape of it. Colton owed Ray Solano $91,000, built up over 2 years of football bets and poker games. He kept believing he was one hand away from winning back. When Solano stopped extending credit, Colton had gone looking for money the only way he knew how, using old ranch documents from his teenage years, half-forgotten paperwork he still had access to from a time when nobody thought to lock a filing cabinet against a boy who was practically a son, to take out a loan against equipment he had no legal right to borrow against. 2 loans, in fact, both in my name, both forged, both used to buy himself just enough time before the debt caught up to him anyway. When that ran out, he decided there was one asset left large enough to solve the problem permanently. Colton pled guilty. Conspiracy to commit murder for hire. Financial fraud. The judge in Presidio County, a woman named Carla Whitfield who'd known our family for 20 years, sentenced him to 18 years, with restitution ordered on top of it. Though everyone in that courtroom understood the ranch's real losses had never only been about money. I did not attend every day of the proceedings. I attended enough. I have written to him once a month since he was sentenced. Not because I've forgiven what he tried to do. I'm not sure forgiveness is even the right word for something that large, but because June used to say that blood deserves one honest chance to become worth keeping, even if it's the only chance you ever give it. I write him about the cattle, the weather, the small, ordinary things a ranch produces year after year regardless of who's inherited it. He writes back sometimes. Mostly he doesn't. I keep writing anyway. I restructured the ranch's trust that same spring with Harold Pruitt, our family's attorney since before I was born, sitting across the same kitchen table where June used to balance the books. Colton's inheritance rights are gone now, permanently, replaced by a scholarship fund in Rose's name for kids in Presidio County who want to study agriculture or veterinary science, but can't afford the tuition. I made Rose a full ranch manager that same week, with an ownership stake in the operation she never once asked for and never expected. She cried when I told her. I think I might have too. Last Sunday evening, I sat on the porch with her the way June and I used to sit, the mesquite fire burning low, the screen door creaking behind us the way it always has, and probably always will, since neither of us has gotten around to fixing it either. I took my father's pocket knife out of my pocket, the one worn smooth on one side from 40 years of the same absent-minded turning, and I pressed it into her palm. This knife belonged to a man who taught me that a person's word is the only fence line that actually matters. I told her, "It's yours now." She held it the way you hold something heavier than its weight. I sat out there a good while after she'd gone home, looking out over the north pasture in the dark, past the windmill still turning slow against the stars, past the fence line where a stranger once waited to end my life over $91,000. My own nephew couldn't bring himself to ask me for honestly. Here is what that morning by the fence, and everything that came before and after it, taught me. Debt didn't make Colton dangerous. It only gave his fear a deadline, and fear with a deadline will make a man do things love alone could never explain. Loyalty was never really a matter of blood on this ranch, not in the end. It was always a matter of who shows up at 2 in the morning, exhausted and afraid, because staying silent felt like a betrayal they couldn't live with. And inheritance, I've come to understand, was never just a name on a deed passed down through however many generations. It's the character you hand off, one honest choice at a time, to whoever proves they're actually ready to carry it. Blood gave me a nephew, I said, mostly to myself, mostly to June, wherever she is now, watching the cattle move slow across the pasture like she always said they would, long after the both of us are gone from this land ourselves. A 2-hour ride in the dark gave me a family.